Record on this.
Well, thank you so much for that. Good morning, classroom. My name is Carlos Rios, and today we're going to be, of course, presenting our presentation for what we call the prison system, a felon's journey, by, of course, me, Carlos Rios, Annika Villa, Reina Cooper, and Mireya Dominguez. So to start off this presentation, a couple of facts and a couple of figures, but the most important thing to start off is, really the history of the United States prison system. Of course, it is a well-known fact that throughout the whole world, out of all the developed countries, the United States leads the prison system with the largest incarceration system in the world, surpassing even China, which endowed has the largest population in the world. So to compare the U.S. prison system to the Chinese prison system, it really is counts a lot of numbers, which is really sad to see because, the United States, quote unquote, the land of the free, there's a lot of people who are unfortunately behind bars. And to further hurt that number is how those prisoners are treated afterwards, where the only real thing that they have is their jail cells, and afterwards they're just kind of left on their own. And that's what we're going to explain today a little bit more. Of course, a big term that you might see in the media or in literature is mass incarceration. Mass incarceration basically showcases that the United States does have has a lot of systems, has a lot of prison systems that, of course, put more people behind bars, which goes to the term mass incarceration. As you can see with the chart here by the Sentencing Project, a independent project, they went ahead and made a graph here that actually showcases how the rise of mass incarceration started back even in the 1925. As you can see, it does have a steady increase. However, it takes a turning point in 1970s, and then far beyond that. As you can see, it skyrockets all the way up until 2018, 2020. But for the most part, the reason why this mass spike in incarceration, it actually has to do a lot with the congressional reforms and a lot of legislation. A lot of laws that were passed during this time did increase incarceration, and for a simple fact, some of the results were indirect, and other results were actually directly made for one reason, and that's to crack down on crime. But of course, it cracks down on minorities, and that's where we're going to go on to the next point, is that I wanted to talk about key legislations that actually caused a lot of these issues. So we have four here that I wanted to bring up. Which has a lot of good points and a lot of bad points as well, depending on the spectrum that you want to see it. But of course, the very first legislation that I wanted to talk about was in 1961 by John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy established an executive order which was establishing the Committee on Juvenile Delinquency and Youth Crime. Essentially, what this legislation or executive order passed on was that it created a juvenile system for youth. And of course, the aim of the program wasn't really necessarily to say, hey, we got to inflict fear and we got to inflict punishment on youth. It was in the ideas of congressmen and women that they wanted to create a system so that they can prevent crime at an early age. However, it had a lot of drawbacks and a lot of missteps. For example, when youth, especially minorities, were exposed to police officers, for example, it caused them to have a negative interactions for the first time with the law. And because of that, most of the time, what ended up happening with these young men and women is that they felt that their first interaction with a police officer or with the law was in a negative way, which caused more emotional toll. And in return, it actually made a lot of problems a lot worse. instead of going a different route like mental health or anything like that, it actually created more emotional problems for the young people. And so because of that, that's one of the indirect results of this law. Uh, Following a couple of years later, President Lyndon B. Johnson, he of course went ahead and did the Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And so what this system did is that it actually created more funding for police departments at a state and local levels. The federal government, for the most part, as you all know, is that it kind of does a separate thing. It doesn't enforce a lot of things on the state governments. However, with this law, it actually funded a lot more training, a lot more involvement with the federal government and the state government. In this case, this actually cracked down on a lot of suburbs and a lot of communities of color. Because more federal funding meant more money, a lot more officers were trained, a lot more tools. But the main thing with this law is that it cost a lot of money to be diverted to the most crime inflicted areas, which in this case, for the most part, were lower economic neighborhoods as well as colored neighborhoods, which of course led to a lot of arrest, which led to a lot of incarceration. This is due because the simple fact that a lot more officers were targeting these areas because it had the money and the funds and the support from the federal government to do so. The next law, of course, I wanted to talk about was in 1966, the Bail Reform Act. Now, a lot of people don't really think too much of mass incarceration with bails, but let me explain a little bit more of how the results were coming from that. Of course, bailing is a common term. Someone gets arrested for, a particular crime. The judges can set a particular amount of money that they can pay them or the family or whoever, so they can be free until their sentencing can be heard. At that point, the person can go ahead and, go about their normal days. But the Bail Reform Act that actually created so that judges can go ahead and do this at their own discretion. Some judges can go ahead and, for example, enact a $200 bail up to a $2 million bail. And so what ended up happening is, of course, a lot of people, especially low-income criminals and offenders, they didn't have the money to be able to pay for bail. And because of that, they're not able to leave. And because of that, they end up staying in the county jail. They get booked. And because of that, they can't really go out anymore and find the support that they need. And in this case, this Bail Reform Act did unfortunately target a lot of people who don't necessarily have the funds to even pay for their own freedom so that they can better prepare for their sentencing. For the most part, this law affects a lot of, like I said, African American communities, a lot of Latino communities, and so forth. The last one, and of course, there's plenty more laws that have contributed to mass incarceration, but like I said, this is kind of like the first stepping stones that actually started it. The last one was in September 1974 by President Richard Nixon. He went ahead and his administration created the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. Essentially, this act was to, of course, kind of go hand in hand with President Kennedy's, the Committee on Juvenile Delinquency. However, this act actually created a digital um, history and network of the delinquencies that these youth made. So, for example, if a young man who was 10 years old and he committed a crime or any sorts of that, it was automatically created into their history. Because of that, you could say they started to get stereotypes of this particular person. For the most part, this would also create a portfolio, quote unquote, where other youth who are almost the same, you could say, profile, they might be targeted because of a certain person. And this essentially creates a stereotypical way of kind of filtering out, saying who could be most vulnerable, who's more vulnerable to commit a crime, and that way they had for example, a way to be able to see, kind of monitored the situation. And so because of that, that would also lead to an increase of incarcerations for a specific type of group. or community. And so these laws, of course, like I said, they had a lot of results, but as well, they also had a lot of effects on a lot of communities, especially, unfortunately, to the African American and the Latino communities. But of course, um, later on in this day and age, we do have reforms that do, of course, try to set up better barriers so that a lot of people have more liberties and that they're able to go ahead and get the help that they need, which goes into what we want to talk about, which is kind of the next step after people leave the prison system, after they're done with their sentencing, which is what we call, of course, the re-entering of society. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide? And then this, of course, is called reentry. For the most part, reentry is a term used for, the opportunity for the prisoner or inmate to go back to their communities. A lot of people don't know that after a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year sentence, people have to go back to their communities. They're not going to magically go, nowhere or go somewhere that they don't know. A lot of prisoners will go back to their friends and family because that's where they are already established. They don't have any other places, but of course, there always come challenges with going back to their um, roots, quote unquote. There's a couple of ways that an inmate can go back to their communities. The very first type is, of course, a supervised community supervision, which for the most part, this kind of goes hand in hand with parole officers. They also have to take requirements such as going to check to their local government facilities on daily basis or sometimes weekly, depending on the information and terms that are done. The second one is a voluntary, where they can go to local or state-supported programs. For example, if someone who is trying to overcome their addictions that they weren't able to do back behind bars, they can go through these programs, as well as get guided information to see how they can restart their life, such as how to make relationships, how to get a job, and so forth, and education purposes. The last one, of course, is, and unfortunately, this is the biggest thing, is that a lot of these comics don't have any type of programs to go back to. They just, once they're out of prison, that's it. They're on their own. And for the most part, most of these people, since they don't have any more opportunities, unfortunately, they go back to a lot of their bad places, such as the people who they used to hang out with, possibly committing crimes with again, which is unfortunate. But thankfully, we have more programs in today's age where they can get a lot more help.
Hi, this is Raina Cooper. So how many felons are there actually in the United States? As of 2020, about 5.17 million people are disenfranchised due to a felony conviction. Disenfranchisement means that they are not allowed to vote in their state. This is also not a whole count of felons because some states, as of 2020, you can vote as a felon. 1 out of every 44 adult Americans have a felony, and 2.27 of the total U.S. voting eligible population in the U.S. are disenfranchised due to a current or previous felony conviction. So these are some graphs. 1 in 3 U.S. Black men had a felony conviction, and 1 in 13 U.S. adults had a felony conviction. This is a very big difference here. Black men are incarcerated at very higher rates than any other adult, and the United States incarcerates more people than anyone in the in the world, because the United States mostly uses private prisons, and private prisons generate a lot of money, and the United States loves income, so they keep incarcerating people to make more money, like through private prisons. So a criminal record reduces the likelihood of a callback or job offer nearly by 50%. With 1 in 4 Americans having a criminal record, this makes it a lot of people not being able to get a job after prison, and gives them more of an opportunity to go back to the crime that they were in before prison. And the United States accounts for 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. which is a lot compared to how much of the population we make up, compared to how many prisoners that we put in prison every year. Percentage of felons. So 1.9 million people were in felony probation in 2015 compared to 1.5 million people in prison. This shows that not only is there a lot of people in prison, there's a lot of people on probation and parole after prison. So this just accounts for so many people with felons not being able to get a job and reoffending back into the system. In 2010, about 23% of the Black population had a felony conviction. In this graph, or in this map here, you can see that in recent decades, every state has had a substantial increase in shared residents with a felony conviction. Florida being the most, with felony convictions. Black people are incarcerated at a much higher rate than any other race. That's including all races. Black people are incarcerated so much more than they are. And in this map of the United States, you can see the disparity per 100,000 people, which is a lot. Just in general, comparing the populations, like it's a lot of people comparative. The next slide, please. Okay. So this is a median annual income for incarcerated people prior to incarceration and non-incarcerated people ages 24 to 42 in 2014 by race, ethnicity, and gender. This society has been tough on crime, and this has resulted in a cycle of poverty and incarceration. You can see in the chart here that incarcerated people have a much lower income than people who have not been incarcerated. And this can be due to increased policing and poverty-stricken neighborhoods. This could be because they don't get a job and they get involved in crime. There's so many factors that goes into this number that it's hard to even list them. But you can see the comparison in numbers from incarcerated people and non-incarcerated people here. So forms and mechanisms of oppression and discrimination that felons have endured. So a form of oppression is can't get a job. This can include companies doing background checks and not hiring based on a felony on their background check, and treating all felons the same, putting them all in this box that all felons are bad, not looking at the felony that they have, not looking at how long ago the felony was. Just if you have a felony, you're bad and you're not going to get hired. So I talked about disenfranchisement earlier, and this means that you can't vote. And get out of prison, that once you finish your parole and your sentencing in some states, you can vote. And that's a way to get involved in politics. But the reason that they don't know this is because people won't tell them they can vote. And another form of oppression is housing. So a lot of companies or banks use background checks for mortgage loans, and they will not give you a mortgage loan if you have a felony. And also landlords now more than ever are doing background checks, and they will not let you rent from them if you have a felony. Another one is travel restrictions. Felons cannot leave the United States legally.
Hi, this is Mireya Dominguez, and I'm going to be doing the summary of the book that we chose, Cyntoia Brown Long, and this is her story, Free Cyntoia. The story of Cyntoia Brown Long caught the attention of media and celebrities in 2017 after a renewed interest in her case was being brought back into the courtroom. Her story took many people by surprise at how a young woman at the age of 16 was trialed as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without a chance of parole, even though there were many signs and diagnosed mental and personality disorders and a family history of mental disorders. After a long battle in the courtroom, Cyntoia Brown was released from prison August 7, 2019 at the age of 31. Growing up, Cyntoia was adopted by an African-American family in Nashville. Her biological father's identity is unknown, and her biological mother was an active drinker throughout her pregnancy with Cyntoia, leading her to give her up for adoption. Cyntoia struggled with racial profilings of not only being a colored girl, but also being too white for those surrounding in her community. From an early age, she spent time in and out of correctional facilities for early encounters with law enforcement. August 26, 2006, Cyntoia was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of aggravated robbery and murder of the first degree for killing 43-year-old real estate agent Johnny Allen, who had picked Cyntoia up from a local Sonic in Nashville for prostitution. Cyntoia told law enforcement that this was an act of self-defense. At the time of her trial sentencing, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders was not constitutional. However, Tennessee prosecutors successfully argued that Brown would technically become eligible for parole after 51 years in the year 2055. While Cyntoia was in prison, she was constantly getting into trouble with the other inmates. At the age of 18, she was being transferred from the Tennessee Prison for Women to where she was no longer needing to be separated from the adult inmates. In this prison, she decided she was no longer going to just grow old in her cell. Dr. Richard Good was the one assigned early on to her case. He was the one to tell her that it was up to her how she spent her time in prison, since she was going to be there either way. Taking his words into consideration, Cyntoia earned her GED, finished a bachelor's degree, and mentored at-risk youth. She joined groups of faith at her prison and found a closer love and connection to God and to her faith, even though it was a hard journey for her. Her biggest struggle that she shared with us was having to forgive her biological mother for giving her up and drinking alcohol while being pregnant with her. Even though it was hard, she did end up forgiving her mother. Cyntoia found an unexpected relationship with Jay Long, or Jamie Long, who was able to help her with her connection to her faith. She found she had a chance to fight for a better life. Before finishing her bachelor's degree, she was required to complete a capstone project, which she chose to do an interview with a local news broadcaster, Stacey Case, in order to get her story out there, since she wasn't actually able to post on social media. During the interview, she just wanted to explain how easy it is for young women to be sucked into a life of crime. However, after her interview, she began to see a lot of support from news networks like ABC and Fox News, and also celebrities such as T.I., Rihanna, Snoop Dogg, LeBron James, and Kim Kardashian. With the outpouring support from the community, celebrities, and media, Cyntoia feared that her clemency case was not going to be heard from the governor. Now more than ever, she doubted her chance. Her legal team reached out to the governor's office to let them know they had nothing to do with the recent outbreak of fame of Cyntoia's case. Instead of falling into the media fame and getting excited over it, she spent her time helping young girls in a juvenile center. She would answer their questions and listen to their stories, and basically she just explained that she wanted to be their support team or support system, like she wished she would have had in her younger years. Most of the girls were facing some of the same charges that Cyntoia had been given early on, such as being transferred to an adult court and child there. After a while, the mentor program was actually cut from the juvenile center, and she was no longer able to mentor the girls, and she took this very hard. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Cyntoia's case was going to get the chance that she had been waiting for all along. She spoke to a board begging for a second chance at life. She begged and she pleaded for redemption at a new life because she knew what she had done years ago was wrong. After hearing from Cyntoia and all of the people who knew her along the way, the board granted her a recommendation to the governor. In January of 2019, the governor granted Cyntoia her freedom. August 7th, 2019, Cyntoia was released from prison 6 months later.
This leads us to the articles that we chose for this project. The first article is a phenomenological study of employer perspectives on hiring ex-offenders. In the research, they found out that the tendency of a convicted criminal to reoffend is directly related to the ex-offender's employment rates. They state that although the consequences of what happens to those who are unable to find work is well known, there was previously little research as to why employers decided not to hire ex-offenders. In this research, they found that it was due to employers having a hard time knowing that the perception of their employees would be judged by their consumers. So although they were aware that ex-offenders needed help getting jobs, they would opt to not hire them because of how they were afraid of being perceived. The major challenge of ex-offender employment problems is the public and how well the ex-offenders' families are willing to support them. Recommendations that could assist felons include requesting that your local businesses hire ex-felons or creating petitions for larger companies to then hire ex-felons. Making sure that felons also have access to a strong support system is highly influential in their success coming out of prison. Another article that we chose is a description of the self-identified needs, service expenditures, and social outcomes of participants of a prisoner reentry program. This article discusses how 122 ex-offenders participated in a study called Project Reconnect. It was a 6-month prison reentry program that was on a volunteer basis. It worked with inmates who had served the maximum prison sentence and helped them to identify what they really needed. Many participants stated that they were worried about accessing transportation, clothing, food, shelter, as well as getting job training for jobs that they actually wanted to do well in and participate in. Each participant of the study was then granted $3,000 to use towards their needs, and the participants would really use the money as they saw necessary for the issues that concerned them. Within the study, it is stated that the study found that when given the opportunity, many ex-offenders elect to participate in programs that are aimed at helping them transition more successfully into society, even if they're not required to as a condition of their parole. It was also stated in the same article that there was a consistency between the items clients identified as needed on release and the items in which they spent their program funding. This then shows us that we need more programs like this, and this is something that we should recommend to people in office and get involved in politics and express this, because it shows that when given the opportunity to do better and create positive life changes, ex-convicted felons do make the right decisions when given money or access to resources that can help to turn their lives for the better. The last article we chose is my mom, my dad, and my girlfriend, and loads of people used to bring him up. The value of social support for ex-offender fathers. This article discusses findings from a qualitative research conducted through an ex-offender father and their probation officers. This article was held as a focus for how critical the role of a family and a social support is for ex-felons who want to pursue positive and long-lasting relationships with their children. By having a strong set of support networks specifically from their family, this can then turn around and become a source of strength and connectivity that can help them to grow past their adversity. It was stated in the article, the research reported from this paper suggests that ex-offending fathers receive social support, both formal and informal, from a wide-ranging and complex network of family, friends, practitioners, which then facilitates and enables their capacity to father. These networks then provide systems of social support and family capital that hold productive possibilities for ex-offender father and their families. This is essentially stating that creating resources that help felons to see their family and children then become a source of strength and help to motivate them for the better. If they have nothing that they're moving towards, then they're more likely to go back into their previous ways and reconnect with people that they perceive as a source of strength, which may be just negatively impacting their lives rather than forming strong bonds with people like their family who they may not have seen very often before being previously incarcerated.
Evidence of resilient strategies that felons have used to cope with social inequalities. The first thing that I want to talk about here is halfway houses. Halfway houses is a broad term used in the criminal justice system, but it can be defined as a residential facility where people leaving prison or jail, completing or sometimes completing a condition of probation, are required to live before being fully released into their communities. So there's several different types of halfway houses, which I will discuss on this next slide. So what we have here is social living homes, halfway houses in the criminal justice system, restitution centers, and community-based or residential correction facilities, and other transitional housing. Halfway houses can be very important to ex-offenders when they're coming out of prison, because it's very hard to go from living in a prison to living in civilization, because it's very, very different. And also, like I mentioned before, it's very hard for for felons to get jobs when they are coming out of prison. So a halfway house can help them find companies who hire felons, help them find housing, and they help them do all these things. And I think this is very important to ex-offenders. Next slide. So these are some companies that hire felons. What I find important about this is that the only reason that I found this is because I was researching felons. It was honestly not something that came up immediately. So to see that all of these big companies hire felons like Coca-Cola, American Airlines, Apple, AT&T, the list goes on, but it's not gave regularly to felons is something that should be put out there more to help felons get rehabilitated into society and find a job. And this is a video from a company that hires ex-felons, and I found it very important to this presentation. Sorry about the quality on that video, but what I really wanted to focus from that video is that this company is out here giving chances to ex-felons, and they're a very good company that makes it a point to hire people who are coming out of prison to give them this second chance, which I find so important. And on this slide here, we have groups that felons can join to improve their rehabilitation. I found these groups on the Lionheart Foundation, and this is updated yearly. So basically, the Lionheart Foundation, what they do is they look in every single state. There's every state on this website, and they find programs that will specifically help felons and help people who have just gotten out of the prison system. Some of the most important ones from New Mexico that I saw were a peaceful habitation, post-prison aftercare ministry, Dismas House, New Mexico, New Mexico's Men's Reentry Academy, families impacted by incarceration. There was a total of 25 programs that assist felons in New Mexico, which I found so important. But another thing that I've mentioned before is that this was hard to find. This was not just something that you Google and you find. The only reason that I found the Lionheart Foundation is because we're doing a study on felons. And this foundation is so important, and I really wish that it was out there more for felons to see, because it's giving them an opportunity to get back into like society. And that's what we're trying to do here, is when people go to prison, you want them to come back rehabilitated, not come out and go right back to crime. So these groups were so important to the rehabilitation of felons.
So some guidelines that we found were important for working with felons through an anti-oppressive, anti-racist, culturally responsive, and culturally humble lens. So guidelines for working with felons include knowing resources that are available that can assist them in forming strong relationships with their support system, as well as resources that can help them to find jobs or get some kind of training that can help them more suitable for a position, as well as getting an aid in really any way that they feel that they need. As mentioned through some of our articles, it's important to know that the client does have self-determination and is aware where they can help. So it's important that you as a social worker direct them towards the things that they think they need rather than what you think they need. Examples of organizations that can help people as far as the state of New Mexico include organizations such as Best Chance, Crossroads for Women, and Fathers Building Futures. I won't go into much about them because these aren't located everywhere, but these are amazing examples of organizations that are available. In working with felons, you also have to work to fight racism. We've mentioned multiple times through this project that people of color are more likely to be sentenced than their white counterparts, and on top of that, they're more likely to be sentenced for longer times with lower crimes. Another example of something that you need to be working on as a social worker who works with felons is keeping them up to date on their rights. So many laws change very, very quickly, and often states have more authority over what happens to them than things that come from like the federal level. So an example of this is in the state of New Mexico. Once you finish your sentence and your parole, you're allowed to vote. This isn't the case for every state, but this is something for ours, and it's important to share this kind of information with a client that's just getting out of prison. Lastly, when you work with felons, you also have to fight any biases that you may have been conditioned to believe. Recognizing that their past is not their character and does not define them is one of the most important parts in being an advocate for them. If you're their social worker, you need to help them to create a better future, and you can't do that if you're holding any judgment towards them, because how can you expect them to fight for a better life if you're also not going to stand there with them and fight with them? Here's also a list of references that we have within the presentation, and we thank you for your time.